Welcome to Kitchen Table Finance.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
I am fantastic. Happy you're back.
Glad to be back. Glad to be
I no
back.
longer have to try to compete against the computer.
Well, yeah, you're going to get replaced by AI, and I'm going to get replaced by coal, and that's the end of the podcast as we know it, right?
Then
So,
we'll have a new podcast, two
yeah,
old retired
yeah,
guys.
yeah. Remember when we used to do a podcast?
There you go. Too much fun. Great episode today. I'm excited about it. This is kind of right in our wheelhouse, just kind of talking through how to put together the pieces of your retirement income puzzle, right? And just kind of
Right.
thinking through conceptually what those sources are and then how to think about them, when to start them, why to start
Yeah.
them, that kind of conversation,
Yeah.
which we have quite a bit around here at Shotwell, Rutter, Baer. But I think the
Right.
first step in this process is just figuring out what you have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. By way of prefacing this, our last couple episodes before I was on hiatus for a week and Cole and you jumped in last week on a different topic, but we were working on how we work on taking someone from working life to retirement. With the first phase of
Mm-hmm.
our process really being focused on life planning, values, what are you trying to do? Then we
Sure.
start looking at, okay, we know what you want to do. Let's take the pieces of the puzzle. I like that metaphor. We've always used that you have, and how do we put those together into something coherent to make the plan work?
Yeah, that's a great point. All of this stuff that we're talking about today, all of the quote unquote pieces of your puzzle, right? Like, first, you got to figure out what the picture on the box looks like, which
Right.
is why we
Yeah.
have those value conversations before we
Yeah.
start moving pieces around.
Yeah.
So, yes, there's some financial thoughts behind each of these things, but really a
hmm
lot of it depends on you and your situation and what you're
Right.
trying to accomplish, because just because it makes financial sense doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
mean it makes sense for you that way, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of subjectivity and a lot of what's out there in the media when it comes to financial planning topics, it makes things seem very cut and dry and very math, right?
Yeah, right.
But when actual financial planners do real financial planning, there's a lot of, well, if you look at it this way,
Yeah,
so people will see that here as we get more into the bits and pieces.
for sure. So just kind of a rundown of some of those things. And for our listeners, you might have some of these, you might have all of these.
Right.
Hopefully you have at least one of these. Um, and
Got to start
so
somewhere.
that's right. So, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is always Social Security, right? Like, what is
Right.
your Social Security benefit? Do you qualify? What does that look like?
Yes.
And if you're unsure, right, they used to send you those nice little letters every year in
Green
the
and
mail,
white.
and then
Yeah.
they stopped doing that, and you had to like create a my social security
Yeah.
gov account, which we recommend that everybody does to
Yeah.
make sure there's no errors, by the way. That would be like the first place to go, is like figure out what that benefit is
Right.
at retirement, right?
Right.
And then this one is becoming more and more rare, Dave, but we still do have clients with pensions out there, right? It is still a
Yes.
thing. It's just
Yep.
pretty uncommon.
Yep. Pensions, a lot of more nowadays, we're seeing folks with old pensions that have been frozen for a while or discontinued, but are
Mm-hmm.
still a benefit, which is still an important part of the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have our retirement savings vehicles, right? So you might have a 401k, IRA, and these, kind of fall into a couple different categories. We have the pre-tax category, and then we also have the Roth category, those things. And then for the rare few of us, there are some, combination of after-tax contributions to a pre-tax account, which makes things a little bit messy. So we won't talk too much about
Yeah,
that,
we
but
don't
just
need
know
to.
that that is out there. And then we also, you may have a taxable portfolio, which we
Yeah,
refer to, or like a brokerage account where there's no retirement wrapper around it, I guess is a
right.
good way to say that, right?
Yeah, and also too, a lot of folks have significant bank savings beyond
Yeah.
what they need for contingency funds and emergencies and current spending. So that's another at least part to consider. If they don't have any bank savings, then that's something we need to address too.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Wouldn't be a kitchen table finance podcast without
If we
talking
didn't
about
work that in
contingency
at some
funds.
point, yeah, we'd check that box for the week.
Yeah, yeah. So there's also some other potential income sources that we see from time to time, right? You might have some
Hmm.
rental real estate income, the old side hustle gig
Sure.
economy coming out there.
Yeah.
Maybe you're planning on
Yeah.
some part-time work, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. We've put into plans before.
Yeah.
You might have some annuity income, either from a qualified or non-qualified source. It just relates to how that income is taxed. And then there's also the potential for getting like a regular gift or slash inheritance
Hmm.
from, usually your parents. But that is also something that occasionally we will put into the plan. Although that's one of those where if you're expecting an inheritance, we usually don't put it in the plan because a lot of things can go wrong with those
Right.
expectations and
Right.
assumptions, right? So for the most part, we leave those out unless it's something that we feel real confident in
Yeah.
terms of like a monthly or yearly gift or something like that we think is going to go
Something
on
that's
for a
been
while.
defined. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which does happen.
So once you kind of round up all of those different sources, then it's kind of a question of figuring out how much will each source provide, right? And
Right.
so Social Security, that answer is somewhat clear in that you can go on Social Security and it will tell you exactly like, here's your benefit at 62, here's your benefit at full retirement
Right.
age, here's your benefit if you wait the longest you can wait, which is age 70. And then there's obviously, as you know, Dave, some different, every month that
Yes.
you wait, you get a little bit different amount, right?
Right.
And so, and the same thing can be said for pensions as well. Sometimes there's some decisions around like if you retire with a certain number of years, when you can start your pension versus
Yeah.
if you have an older pension that they kind of shut down, when that would start. And I think for both of these two, some of the confusion around that people get is, that these things don't necessarily have to start when you retire, right?
Yeah.
So, if your pension starts at 65, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to work until 65, right?
We were talking about this offline that, we still talk to people that think you automatically start your Social Security when you retire.
Right.
And in some cases, that is the right choice. But,
Mm-hmm.
those are some of we'll get to the decisions there in a minute. But you don't necessarily have to start Social Security
Yeah.
right when
Yep.
you retire.
For sure. And then I think, the other trickier question is how much can I intend to take out of my portfolio?
Yeah.
Like, what is my monthly annual withdrawal from my portfolio? And there's a lot of different math and configurations that go into that, right?
Yeah. 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 Do we want to talk about some of the rules of thumb
Yeah,
here
I
for
think that
people that are
makes
doing it on
sense.
their own? Yeah.
For sure.
The easiest and simplest that I think gets people in the ballpark is the old 4% rule, right?
Yep.
And that's
Hmm.
based on some research that's been around for a while that looked at the history of the markets and basically came up with the idea that if you start looking at kind of a normal retirement age, say mid 60s, and begin withdrawing 4% of your retirement portfolio, that should be sustainable regardless of what the markets do, through a normal lifespan, and give you the ability to adjust it for normal inflation. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of assumptions built into that.
Yep.
But, if nothing else, if you just need to get an idea of whether you can retire or not, and if you've got $1 million 401k, you can probably plan on $40,000 a year of income as kind of a baseline.
Yeah. It's a good place to start to conceptually think about this stuff. But
Hmm.
like the concern of a rule of thumb, especially that one that's been kind of vetted in
Yeah.
and out of,
Yeah.
is, a lot of it is back tested of like, this is what would have
Yeah.
happened and nobody knows what the future
Nobody
holds,
knows what the
right?
future is going to look like. Right. It's not perfect. Every time the market changes for better or for worse, you see is the 4% rule dead? Is it
Right.
now 4.5% because the markets have been booming? Is it now 3.5% because we're worried about this, that, and the other?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
if you average all those things out,
Yeah.
you still end up back at 4% as kind of a baseline,
I think
foot in
that's
the
a
door,
good
kind of.
point. And I guess what I would say to that, especially for our listeners that are kind of doing it on your own, like if you're 20, even 10 years out from retirement, like just thinking of that conceptually is like a good kind of goalpost,
Yeah.
right? But as you get closer, you want to be much more specific around what that actually looks like and what it actually means, and what you can rely on and feel comfortable with, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
some people would be perfectly fine taking out 4%, knowing the risk that is associated with that, and the adjustments that might have to be made in order to, not run out of money. And some people might
Mm-hmm.
be super freaked out by the fact that there may be a good chance that you have to make a major adjustment to your future income, right? And so they might
Yeah.
want to have a lower withdrawal rate. And then obviously just thinking through some of your other sources, like, if you have rental real estate, like how secure is that? Do you have, a property
Mm-hmm.
that you're flipping over, and do you have months where you're
Yeah.
not getting income? Is that like a common thing?
Yeah. And how long do you want to be doing that?
Yeah,
Too,
well,
I mean,
it's a very
which is
good
a
question.
realistic question, but this kind of goes back to the life planning aspects we've already talked about. But I think people overestimate in general their desire
Mm-hmm.
to do those same kind of things, into their 80s. I just had this conversation with a client the other day. They have a rental property. It's producing good income right now.
Mm-hmm.
We just put it in their plan as though that income goes, and it's kind of she doesn't have a lot of direct involvement. It will either be a stream of income or it will be a sale that will produce a comparable
Right.
stream of income. I mean, within
Yep.
marginal, so from a planning standpoint, it's not like you need to nail those things down, but it is good to think about it.
Yeah,
Um,
and I love thinking through, because I've got a couple clients in the same kind of similar boat of like, okay, here's what happens if you sell it for what you think
yeah,
it's worth,
yeah,
and here's what kind of income we can produce, and here's how it potentially changes your plan or doesn't, right?
right,
And here's like the
right,
low end or the high end of that, right?
right.
We already talked a little bit about the whole gift inheritance type of thing,
Hmm.
and then the annuity income is another thing. Like if you have an annuity or you're
Yeah,
thinking about annuitizing, what are those kind of decisions? What does that look
yeah.
like?
Uh,
And what kind of income can you plan on from stuff like that?
Another one, side hustles and part-time work. The way I approach that usually, because it's a little difficult when you're 64 and you haven't retired yet to say, oh yeah,
Hmm.
I'm going to make half my salary and work for another 4 years. If we're going to model it, we need to plug something in. So a lot of
Yeah,
times we'll back into kind of like, hey, the plan works really well in its current configuration if you make at least X for 2 years, for
right.
Y years, and,
Yeah,
and try to make like conservative assumptions that we know will work. And if they end up working 4 years or making more, great. It's just
yeah,
extra. But that
yep.
way they kind of have an idea of what to expect as kind of a baseline start.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Like I always like to be more conservative on those,
Hmm.
because you never know like what that's going to turn into. And usually
Yeah.
it's, one of two things. One of like, it's like, I just can't do it anymore. Or it's
Hmm.
like, there's no point in me working part-time to make half the money when I'm not doing half the work. So I might as
Yeah.
well just keep working full
Yeah.
time. We
Yeah.
get some of that too, right?
Yeah, I've seen it go both ways though too. I've also seen people that were like, "Hey, I should have gone part time, 5 years
Yeah,
earlier because I can do
right.
this until I'm 75."
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
It goes that way too, and sometimes that's the right answer. And again, we keep circling back to the fact you got to do the life planning before you
right.
make any of
Yeah.
the money decisions, right?
For sure. Very good point. So once you kind of have an idea of what kind of how much each source will provide for you, the next step in the process is, what source or sources do you take first, right? And how does
Right.
that kind of play into this decision making process?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
usually for most people, this result revolves around that Social Security timing decision, right? Episode on Social Security and claiming strategies. We'll have to link to that in the show notes. We're not going to go too deep into that. But I think
Right.
for today's purposes, just thinking through like, what impact does delay have on those numbers, right? And like
Yes.
thinking through the longevity questions of, hey, everyone in my family lived to 95, so I've got a pretty good shot of it, and
Yeah.
thinking through like
Which would
maybe
argue for
delaying.
delay, right? And kind of circling back to the 4% rule, right? When we do a plan, it's much more nuanced than that. A lot of times when you look at the life of the plan, it might average 4%, but if you're going to delay Social Security, it might be a 10% withdrawal for 3 or 4 years, and then
Yeah,
a 2% withdrawal because now once
right.
Social Security starts, it's a bigger number. So how those pieces fit together is really the key.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of, and that's my other point on here we touched on a little bit, but just because you retire doesn't mean you have to start Social Security. And a
Yeah.
lot of our clients retire at Social Security age, but end up delaying and using their portfolio and other income sources to make up that difference until you start Social Security.
Yeah.
Another kind of small things in that Social Security decision. If you do plan on continuing to work and take Social Security, like early Social Security before full retirement age, there's that work penalty. And so you can only earn so much. And it is a pretty significant penalty where you pay back $1 for every $2 you earn over the limit. Right.
Right. And the way we've approached that is that if you even think you might be close, you should delay.
Yeah,
if you think you might earn enough before you reach full retirement. Once you reach full retirement age, it doesn't matter. You can make as much as you want. Then it's more a question of need versus, the Social Security growing. Because if you're working full time and making more than that, you probably don't need your Social Security.
Right. Well, we do have occasionally I'll run across people that start Social Security early and then decide they want to go back to work, and you can't actually stop taking Social Security, right? So there is some wiggle room there a little bit. These are all things that you have to kind of think through and pay attention to. Another one, a very obscure one that doesn't come up very often, is if you have minor children, which, I realize for most 62-year-olds is not a common thing.
It's come up a few times, but yeah, it's not something we deal with very often.
Yep. And so if they're younger than 18 or between 18 and 19 and still a full-time student in an elementary or secondary school, or 18 or older with a disability that began before age 22. Certain circumstances also, like if you're taking care of a grandchild, stepchild, or something like that, that would also. And so not only would you qualify for Social Security, but they would get a Social Security benefit from your retirement payment as well as your dependent. So that does change the equation a little bit of when to take Social Security and something to think through without getting into too much more detail than that.
Yeah, and I don't want to go into detail on this part either, but if you're married, how your benefit relates to your spouse's benefit and differences in ages and longevity all has to be part of that calculus.
So if you're interested in that, I will link our episode on Social Security claiming strategies to the show notes. And then the other thing to think about is your pension, if you have one, right? Like what's the retirement age there? What are the decisions there as it relates to spousal benefits, right? Are you taking straight life, or do you have a spouse? Are you taking 100% survivor, 50, 75?
Just about every pension is different.
Yeah.
So you need to get the rules for your particular pension. It's not like Social Security where we've got a pretty good flow chart on what to do. And there, usually the big decision is when to start. When does it make the most sense to start? Sometimes we'll see the formulas will encourage you to start around a particular date.
Right.
Because it just won't grow as much after particular points. And then spousal coverage decisions tend to be the other big decision factor in pensions.
That's another tricky one that you really have to kind of think through, like, because you're trying to predict the future, right? Like how long is your spouse going to live versus you? Like what's the age difference? There's a lot of different factors that go into that you really need to kind of pay attention to.
We tend to take kind of the subjective personal approach, like what would it mean to your spouse if you rather than try to do the math, just or think about it from the other end of the equation. Okay, if something happened to you at age 70, what would your spouse have to do if your pension wasn't there?
Right.
And what if something happened to you at 80? What would that look like? Because it's going to be different. And just try to kind of wrap our heads around what the impact would be.
Yeah.
And go from there.
Well, and I think too, like I like to think of it in terms of like, here's all of your income sources, right? And if something happens to one of you, these are the ones that we're getting rid of, right? Like you only get to collect one Social Security.
Right.
Good news for you is you get to collect the highest one.
Yeah.
Bad news is you only get one. And then are we having that same discussion about pension? So are we losing a pension income and a Social Security income? Like sometimes that's a pretty big hit. And how do we replace that? And what's the comfort level there, right?
Right.
And then from there, once you kind of figure out that pension, Social Security decision, then we got to talk about how to choose what investment account to start taking out of and how much you can
Yeah.
take out of it, right? And so there's a couple of different schools of thought here, a couple different ways that you can go. One of them is just straight up pro rata. So, whatever percentage that you want to take out, take it equally or, based on the value of each of those different sources, which is one that we probably see the least often. All right. And
For
then
good reason.
the other one, which is kind of our default place where we start, is taking it out of a taxable portfolio, then the tax deferred portfolio, then the tax free portfolio.
Yeah.
Is kind of like the default, but there's some pros and cons to that too. A lot of this
Right.
goes into tax planning, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where it's hard to talk about what is the right thing for a do-it-yourselfer because it is so nuanced. Probably for kind of like the 4% rule of thumb, I would start with the taxable, then tax deferred, then tax free as kind of the baseline. But within that, then you want to think about, okay, if I delay all of my IRA, all my tax deferred distributions until I'm in my 70s, are my required minimums going to actually have a worse tax effect than if I'd
Right.
spread
Yeah.
those out? And if you're going to
Mm-hmm.
spread them out, are you doing Roth conversions because you have other money to spend? There's a lot of different factors,
Yeah.
and Roth conversions, whether they're worth it or not, a lot of that comes down to how you think about legacy planning and what you want to. Would you rather pay taxes now? If you're not likely to spend all that money, you're basically prepaying the taxes for your kids, right?
Right.
And sometimes that's important, and sometimes it's not.
Right.
So
Well,
lots
the flip
of
side of that, if you don't have kids and you want to give everything to charity, then the charity
it
doesn't,
doesn't matter, right? Why pay?
exactly.
Why should you pay the taxes? Because the charity isn't going to pay them either.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of push and pull there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, lots of things to kind of think through on the tax aspect of that. And then also, like, without getting into too much detail again, which is kind of challenging to do for this topic, but like, how does that taxable, tax deferred, tax free decision impact what kind of taxes you're paying on your Social Security, right? Because your Social Security is taxed based on how much income that you have as well. And so there's a lot of different decision points that go into that. And then also, if you're in if you and your spouse, if we're planning for a couple, what account do we take from first, right? Are your ages the same? That kind of decision making process too, right? If you have different ages, do you take from the older spouse's account first? Part of that
Right.
depends on what type of account and all that. And then from there, once you kind of figure out a game plan for where you're going to take money, then you have to think about the asset allocation decisions that go along with the account you're taking money from and how you should allocate those accounts potentially differently.
Yeah, with just in a simple high level version of that is you want to be more conservative on the accounts you're going to use sooner.
So thinking through that asset location of what you've got in what account based on when you're taking those distributions. As we can see, Dave, lots of decisions to make as far as like putting those income decisions together and how to strategically think through all that stuff. One other thing that I want to mention too is because we got really technical with, what's the best withdrawal strategy, things like that. What's the best Social Security strategy? We kind of sometimes flip all of this on its head when it comes down to like, what type of person are you? And we've talked a lot the last couple of weeks about going from spender to saver. And sometimes we just throw some of this out the window and say, hey, you've got more than enough money to do all these things, but you're not spending it. And so maybe starting Social Security, you feel better about having that income coming in. It allows you to spend more and feel better and not like you're living paycheck to paycheck or relying so heavily on your portfolio. For some people, that's a great decision, right?
Right.
It's just kind of a different way of thinking through, like, does this make sense for me? And not necessarily thinking through, like, what's the way to end up at the end of the plan with the most money, right? Like, that's not always the best way to go about thinking through some of these decisions. So with that, lots of information, lots of stuff going
Yeah.
on. This stuff does get technical, but it's a good place to think about. Just in kind of summing it all up is really identifying what your sources are, thinking through some of those rule of thumbs, and thinking through like all of these decisions that are to kind of build that retirement income strategy. So if our listeners have questions about any of that, we would love to help. Reach out to us at info@srbadvisors.com. And Dave, as always, good to have you back. It's been a pleasure, my friend.
It's good to be back, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another chat about your retirement and finances. Please hit that subscribe button. You can also contact us at srbadvisors.com or email us at info@srbadvisors.com. See you next time on Kitchen Table Finance.
This is a Zedia Media production.